When I was a younger rabbi, I decided that I was going to take up golf for two reasons. The first is that I needed to get some exercise, and I wanted to avoid going to the gym as much as possible. And the second is I wanted to find out why so many people were missing Saturday morning services to go to the golf course. 12 years later, I could tell you I have my answer. Many more people cry out to God on the golf course than they do on synagogue on a Shabbos morning. This past Wednesday, I played the worst 9 holes of golf I have ever played, and even I found myself taking a moment to reflect and to pray. Okay, God, I said, listen, this isn't going so well. I go to temple a few times a week. The guys I'm playing with haven't gone since the holidays. Would it kill you to let me hit something straight on the fairway today? I'm not even going to bother this morning telling another joke about somebody going to the golf course to pray to God, because there are so many bad ones that it has become almost cliche to tell those kinds of jokes. A few weeks ago, I met with my confirmation class, and we spoke about the meaning of prayer. We spoke specifically about why certain prayers are appropriate, why other prayers are not appropriate. And we studied the famous passage in the Talmud that teaches that, for example, if your wife conceives a child, you're not supposed to pray for either a boy or a girl. Why? Because we're not supposed to pray for things that have already been determined. Yet, one of the more interesting paradigms that was also pointed out in this curriculum is the difference between what the writer calls, on the one hand, prayer, and on the other hand, magical thinking. Imagine, for example, that you are a student. Let's say you're waiting to get back the results of a test, and you're sitting in your seat, and you say, God, I pray that I do well on this test. Y'all know that's not prayer. That is magical thinking. As an aside, by the way, Jews literally invented magical thinking. How do I know this? The very words abracadabra are also from the Talmud. Abra, as I create them, kedabra, so too it will be, or as I will be make them into being. As I speak them, these words will happen. That's the meaning of the expression abracadabra. And so when a golfer on the course prays to God for a hole-in-one, or a baseball player crosses himself at home plate with the hopes of getting a good hit, this is not prayer, generally speaking. It is magical thinking. And yes, when I was having my crummy day on the golf course and praying to God to fix my swing, I was also out of luck. On the other hand, if what you are doing is looking deep inside of yourself, internally, for reassurance and for strength, and you pray to God to channel that inner perseverance that has been inside of you all along, that is something quite different. That is not magical thinking. That is prayer. That is something that has not already been ordained by heaven or set into motion by science. That is what prayer is supposed to be all about. When we encounter Yaakov, Jacob in the Torah this week and last week, I often wonder whether Jacob understands the difference between prayer and magical thinking. Let's admit it, Jacob makes some really funny prayers in the Torah, doesn't he? Last week, he makes a promise to God where he says that if God does X and Y and Z, then only in that moment when those things take place, God would be Jacob's God. The rabbis naturally have a field day with this one. How could Jacob make his relationship with God contingent on him getting a hole-in-one on the golf course? It's no better than when my daughter Haley goes to her friend Charlie and says, Charlie, if you give me that, I promise that I'll be your best friend. Then in this week's parasha, Jacob does it again. He holds God to account. He says, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Esav. God, save me from my brother Esau, lest he strike me and kill my children. All of us understand that kind of prayer. We've done it. We've been living through a pandemic. We've all prayed, God, save me from this deadly virus. But do we really think that God has the power to intervene in our lives in that way, if it's also not complemented by making good, safe choices? Do we really think that God has the power to intervene in our lives magically as if to make a difference? Or can we, all of us in this room, just recognize that ultimately whether we survive or not is up to us and the choices that God inspires us to make? Enter the famous struggle with an angel that we read this week. There are many interpretations to the story, but to me, the fact that this story precisely follows Jacob's instance of magical thinking is exactly the reason why it's here. Why are these two passages adjacent to one another? Why do we read a story about Jacob's magical thinking that is followed by the story of Jacob's wrestling with an angel? I think that all of us who are in this understand that it is here because God wants to teach Jacob a lesson. Jacob has to understand that the words, Hatzileni ya miyad achi miyad Esav, God, save me from the hands of my brother Esau, mean nothing if it is not through his own perseverance and struggle that his prayer will be answered. God doesn't give a golfer a hole-in-one just because they pray for it. That student sitting in the pews or in the seats after the test is not going to get that A just because they asked for it in that moment. Jacob's prayer to God, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Esav, save me from my brother Esau, is just not enough. But then Jacob wrestles. He struggles. And that shows that his prayer was ready to be carried to fruition. This coming week or so, we're going to celebrate Hanukkah. And I've always been struck by the fact that when it comes to Hanukkah, we say a blessing, a bracha, over the candle lighting. And what do we say? Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav. God has commanded us to light this Hanukkah menorah. Now, we all know that the story of Hanukkah is not in the Torah. God's role in the story, at best, is limited to a story in the Talmud about lighting oil. And yet we all say we were commanded by God to light the Hanukkah candles. Only we weren't commanded by God to light Hanukkah candles. Or were we? I think if you look back on the real miracle of Hanukkah through the prism of this magical thinking on the one hand and prayer on the other, it's hard to understand at first. Only if we come to understand that what is miraculous about Hanukkah is not the miracle of the oil, but the miracle of Jewish perseverance, then it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? God imbued the Maccabees with faith, and that faith gave them the ability to fight. That's what they did. That is how we are commanded in this story. Had the Maccabees prayed, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Esav, God, save me from the hands of these evil Greeks, we wouldn't be here. We would have gotten absolutely, positively nowhere. Had they prayed for God to supply the hole-in-one, that would have been magical thinking, which is why they didn't. The Maccabees stood up. What's the song we sing, and that Israelis sing? Maccabi Moshia Ufodah. It was the Maccabees who saved us and redeemed us and stood up. It was their resilience that is the miracle of Hanukkah. It was they who fulfilled the hearts and desires of the people living in Eretz Yisrael. You know, folks, in the world in which we live, the message this Shabbos is simple. We need more Maccabees. We all must learn from the lesson of Yaakov. Crying out for help is meaningless if we are also not willing to fight for what our beliefs are and to stand up for them. We can pray for inspiration, but we must always take that inspiration and put it into action and to resolve if we're going to solve the problems in our world. No matter if we're on the golf course, if we want to study and get an A on the test, if we are wrestling with an angel, that is the message of the parasha, and that is the message of Hanukkah. And so here it is, folks. Strive to be a Maccabee. Bring light to the world by standing up for your beliefs in the dark times in which we live. Shabbat Shalom. At this time, I'd like to invite those who are leading the prayer for our country and the prayer for Israel to join me on the bima. Page 177 in the Siddur.